Baby bear begs humans to save his pregnant mom, trapped in a mud pit. Then a miracle happened. The morning air in the Cascade foothills was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Early September had brought cooler nights, and the forest floor was carpeted with fallen needles and the first amber leaves of autumn. A thin mist hung between the trees, softening the edges of the world. It was the kind of morning that felt timeless, as if nothing could disturb the ancient rhythm of the wilderness. But something was wrong. Mark Halloway had been hiking the same trail for 12 years. He knew every bend, every clearing, every place where the creek widened into pools of dark water. A wildlife photographer by trade and a naturalist by passion, he'd come to this remote corner of Washington state to capture the seasonal migration of elk. His camera hung heavy around his neck, and his boots moved quietly over the soft ground. He'd learned long ago that patience and silence were the keys to seeing what the forest wanted to show you. That's when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. High-pitched, insistent, almost plaintive. Not quite a bark, not quite a cry. It came from somewhere off the trail, deeper into the thick undergrowth where the alders grew close, and the land dipped toward an old dried riverbed. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and stay with us. Mark paused, tilting his head. The sound came again, closer now. And then he saw movement, a small dark shape emerging from the ferns. His breath caught. A bear cub. No more than 4 or 5 months old, its fur still fuzzy with youth, its ears rounded and uncertain. The cub stopped at the edge of the trail, staring directly at him. Mark's first instinct was to back away. Where there was a cub, there was a mother, and a mother bear was not something you wanted between you and safety. But the cub didn't run, it didn't retreat. Instead, it took a tentative step forward, then another. Its small black eyes locked on Mark's face. It made that sound again, urgent, desperate, almost pleading. The cub turned its head, looking back toward the undergrowth, then back at Mark. It repeated the motion, again and again. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. Every piece of wilderness training he'd ever received told him not to approach a bear, not to engage, not to interfere. But this was different. This was a cub actively seeking human help. That only happened when something was terribly wrong. He made his decision in seconds. Moving slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice, he followed the cub into the thicket. Branches scraped his jacket, mud sucked at his boots. The cub kept glancing back, making sure he was still following, its small body pushing through the brush with surprising determination. The forest opened suddenly into a depression, a natural basin where winter runoff had carved a shallow ravine. And there, in the center of what had once been a seasonal marsh, was the mother bear. She was trapped. The mud pit was deceptive. What looked like solid ground from a distance was actually a thick, clay-heavy mire that had swallowed her up to her chest. Her massive body was half submerged, her front legs struggling uselessly against the viscous mud. Her fur was matted and dark with moisture, her breathing labored. She'd clearly been there for hours, maybe longer. Exhaustion showed in every line of her body. But what struck Mark most was her eyes. They were calm, watchful, and filled with something that looked almost like understanding. She didn't roar or threaten. She simply watched him, her cub pacing anxiously at the edge of the pit, whimpering. Mark stepped closer, careful to test the ground with each footfall. The mud near the edges was firmer, but he could see where the mother had broken through, where the deceptive surface had given way beneath her weight. She was a black bear, probably around 300 pounds, and she was pregnant. Her belly was visibly swollen, even through the mud. "Okay," Mark whispered, more to himself than to the bears. "Okay, we're going to figure this out." The cub looked up at him, and in that moment Mark felt the full weight of what was happening. This small creature had done something extraordinary. It had overcome instinct, overcome fear, and sought help from the one species that could provide it. The trust in that act was staggering. Mark pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. They were miles from the nearest road, deep in terrain that cell towers didn't reach. He looked back toward the trail, calculating distances, weighing options. The ranger station was at least an hour's hike away. By the time he got help and brought people back, it might be too late. The mother bear was already showing signs of hypothermia, her body heat leached away by the cold mud, and if she went into shock or if she gave birth in that pit, he couldn't think about that. Mark circled the pit, examining it from every angle. The mud was deepest in the center, maybe 5 feet down to solid ground. The mother had struggled, and in struggling, she'd only sunk deeper. Her front legs were pinned. She couldn't get leverage, couldn't pull herself out. She was trapped as surely as if she'd been chained. The cub stayed close to Mark now, as if understanding that this human was their only hope. It nuzzled against his leg once, leaving a smear of mud on his pants, then returned to the edge of the pit, crying softly to its mother. Mark's mind raced. He had rope in his pack, 50 feet of climbing rope, always carried in case of emergency. He had a first aid kit, a multi-tool, water energy bars, nothing designed for rescuing a 300-pound pregnant bear from a mud pit. But he had to try. He knelt and began uncoiling the rope, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The mother bear watched every movement. She was intelligent enough to know what was happening, intelligent enough to remain still, to conserve her energy. She was betting everything on the strange, upright creature that her cub had brought back. Mark looked into her eyes again, and he made a silent promise. "I won't leave you. We're going to get you out." The forest around them was utterly silent now, as if holding its breath. The mist had begun to lift, and slants of golden sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating the scene with an almost sacred light. A mother fighting for her life, a cub refusing to give up, and a human standing at the intersection of nature and compassion, about to attempt something that seemed impossible. Mark tied one end of the rope into a secure loop and tested the knot. He had one chance to get this right. One chance to save a life, maybe 3 lives counting the unborn cubs. His hands didn't shake, his resolve didn't waver. "All right, Mama Bear," he said quietly. "Let's bring you home." Mark had been around animals his entire life, but he'd never felt a moment quite like this. As he stood at the edge of that mud pit, rope in hand, he understood that what happened next would define something fundamental, not just about the bears, but about who he was. He'd grown up in rural Montana, the son of a veterinarian mother and a Forest Service father. His childhood had been spent in the company of injured hawks, orphaned fawns, and the occasional bear cub brought in by rangers. His mother had taught him that every creature deserved dignity, that suffering recognized no boundaries between species. His father had taught him that nature was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was, and that humans had a responsibility to tread carefully within it. But it was a memory from 20 years ago that surfaced now, vivid and sharp. Mark had been 16, helping his mother treat a dog that had been hit by a car. The dog's owner, an elderly woman, had wept openly as his mother worked. "Please," she'd whispered, "she's all I have." And Mark had seen something in his mother's face then, a fierce determination that transcended medicine or duty. It was love meeting crisis and refusing to yield. He felt that same determination now. The mother bear shifted slightly, her breathing labored. The mud made an obscene sucking sound. The cub whimpered and pressed closer to Mark's leg, as if drawing courage from his presence. Mark reached down briefly, touching the cub's head, a gesture of reassurance. The cub didn't flinch. Trust had already been established. Mark studied the situation with the methodical focus he'd developed through years of navigating wilderness emergencies. The rope alone wouldn't be enough. He couldn't lasso the bear. The angle was wrong, and even if he could, pulling on her neck or torso might injure her or the unborn cubs. He needed leverage, something to distribute the force. His eyes scanned the surrounding area. 20 feet away, a fallen Douglas fir lay across the ravine, its trunk thick and solid. It had probably come down in last winter's storms. Mark's mind began constructing a plan, crude, improvised, but possible. He could use the tree as an anchor point, create a pulley system with the rope, and somehow get a harness under the bear's front legs. It would require getting into the mud with her. The thought made his stomach tighten. If she panicked, if maternal instinct overrode her exhaustion and she lashed out, he could be killed. A bear's strength was immense, even when weakened. But when he looked at her again, he saw only that same calm watchfulness. She was assessing him too, deciding whether to trust this strange intervention. "I need you to stay calm," Mark said softly, speaking more for his own benefit than hers. "I know you're scared. I know you're tired. But we're going to do this together." He approached the edge of the pit slowly, testing each step. The ground held firm near the perimeter. The cub followed, staying close. Mark could smell the earth now, rich and organic, mixed with the musk of the bear's fear. He tied one end of the rope around the fallen tree trunk, creating a solid anchor, then fashioned the other end into a wide loop that could slide under the bear's front legs. The hard part would be getting it in position. Mark removed his jacket and boots, setting them aside. He'd need mobility, and he couldn't afford the extra weight if he started to sink. The September air raised goosebumps on his arms. He coiled several feet of rope over his shoulder, took a deep breath, and stepped into the mud. It was cold, shockingly cold. The mud came up to his shins immediately, then his knees as he took another step. The consistency was like thick clay, resisting every movement. Now he understood how the mother bear had become so hopelessly trapped. What looked solid betrayed you instantly, and once you were in, every struggle only sealed your fate more completely. The mother bear's eyes tracked his approach. Her nostrils flared, reading his scent. Mark kept his movements slow and deliberate, speaking in that same low, steady voice. "Easy, Mama. Easy. I'm here to help." The cub paced anxiously at the edge, making soft huffing sounds. It seemed torn between staying safe and joining them in the pit. Mark was waist-deep now, close enough to touch the mother bear. Her size was overwhelming at this proximity. Her head alone was massive, her teeth visible even though her mouth was closed. She could end him in seconds if she chose to, but she remained still, as if she understood that this small, vulnerable creature, wading through the same mud that held her captive, was her only hope. "Good girl," Mark whispered. "That's it. Just stay calm." He reached forward with the rope loop, trying to work it under her left front leg. The mud resisted, creating a vacuum. His fingers were already numb from the cold. The bear shifted slightly, helping him by lifting her leg a fraction of an inch. The intelligence in that moment struck him profoundly. It took nearly 20 minutes to work the rope into position, feeding it under both front legs and pulling it snug across her chest. Mark's arms ached, his legs were going numb, but finally he had a secure harness that wouldn't injure her when tension was applied. He waded back to solid ground, his muscles trembling with cold and exertion. The cub immediately came to him, sniffing his muddy clothes, its small body radiating anxiety and hope in equal measure. Mark knelt briefly, and the cub pressed its face against his chest, a gesture so human in its need for comfort that Mark felt his throat tighten. "Your mom's tough," he told the cub. "She's not giving up, and neither are we." Mark stood and examined his work. The rope stretched from the bear to the tree trunk, but he needed mechanical advantage. Using his multi-tool, he cut several branches from a nearby alder and fashioned a simple Spanish windlass, a primitive pulley system created by wrapping rope around a stick and using it to twist and tighten. It was crude, but physics didn't care about elegance. He positioned himself at the windlass, braced his feet, and began to turn. The rope went taut. The tree groaned softly. The mother bear felt the pressure and instinctively pushed with her hind legs. The mud made that terrible sucking sound again, resisting, holding on. Mark's muscles burned. He kept turning, kept pulling, putting every ounce of strength into the effort. Nothing happened. The bear was simply too heavy, the mud too thick. Mark paused, gasping for breath. His hands were raw. Frustration and fear threatened to overwhelm him. He looked at the cub, who watched him with those trusting black eyes, and then at the mother who had stilled again, conserving her energy. He couldn't fail. Not now. Not when they'd come this far. An idea formed, risky, but possible. He could redirect the rope through a higher branch on the fallen tree, creating a better angle that would lift as well as pull. It would require re-rigging everything, but it might generate enough force to break the mud's grip. Mark worked quickly now, racing against time and the bear's fading strength. He climbed onto the fallen tree trunk, tied off a new configuration, and created a 2-to-1 pulley advantage. The physics were better now. The angle was better. It had to work. He returned to the windlass, gripped the stick, and looked one more time at the mother bear. "This is it," he said. "Give me everything you've got." He turned the windlass. The rope sang with tension. The bear felt it and pushed, her powerful hind legs driving against the mud. Mark pulled harder, his back screaming, his hands slipping on the wood. The cub let out a cry that seemed to echo through the forest. And then movement. Just an inch, then another. The mud seal was breaking. The mother bear surged forward, her instincts taking over, her body remembering how to fight. Mark pulled with everything he had. The rope bit into the tree bark. The windlass creaked dangerously. With a sound like the earth itself surrendering, the mother bear broke free. She surged forward onto solid ground, mud streaming from her body, her legs shaking with exhaustion but holding her weight. She collapsed onto her side, breathing heavily, steam rising from her matted fur in the cool morning air. The cub rushed to her, crying out, nuzzling her face, her neck, climbing onto her in pure joy. The mother bear's eyes closed briefly, and Mark could have sworn he saw relief in her expression. Mark dropped the windlass and fell to his knees, his entire body trembling. He'd done it. Against impossible odds, he'd actually done it. The mother bear opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. And in that gaze was something profound. Recognition, gratitude, connection. For a long moment, human and bear simply regarded each other across the small distance, both exhausted, both alive, both part of something larger than themselves. The sun had fully risen now, and the forest was waking around them. Birds called. The wind moved through the trees. Life continued, as it always did, but nothing would ever be quite the same. The mother bear lay on her side, her massive chest rising and falling in exhausted rhythm. Mud caked her entire body, drying in the strengthening sunlight, making her look like some ancient creature emerging from the earth itself. The cub stayed pressed against her, making soft sounds of comfort and relief, occasionally licking at her face with small, earnest swipes of its tongue. Mark sat on the ground 10 feet away, his own body still shaking from exertion and cold. His legs were numb, his hands raw and bleeding in places where the rope had cut into them. But he barely noticed. His attention was entirely on the bears, watching for any sign of distress or injury. The mother bear's eyes were open but heavy-lidded. That concerned him. So did the way she hadn't yet tried to stand, though several minutes had passed since her rescue. Bears were resilient creatures. She should have been on her feet by now, putting distance between herself and the human who had helped her. Instead, she remained motionless, except for that labored breathing. Mark's photographer's eye had trained him to notice details others might miss, and now those details were accumulating into a picture that worried him. The bear's breathing wasn't just exhausted, it was shallow, irregular. Her gums, visible when the cub nuzzled her mouth open, looked pale. And there was something in the way she held her body, a subtle tension in her abdomen that made alarm bells ring in Mark's mind. His mother's voice came back to him from years of watching her work. When an animal won't move after trauma, there's usually a reason. Look deeper. Mark rose slowly, his legs protesting. He needed to assess her condition more carefully. but he also needed to respect the fundamental danger of approaching a wild animal, especially a mother with her cub. Yet the cub had trusted him. The mother had trusted him. That fragile bridge of understanding was still intact. "I need to check on you," Mark said quietly, as if the bear could understand his intent, if not his words. "I need to make sure you're okay." The mother bear's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his voice. Her eyes followed as he moved closer, but she didn't try to rise, didn't growl or show teeth. The cub looked up at Mark, then back at its mother, as if asking for permission. Mark knelt at a safe distance, close enough to observe but far enough to retreat if needed. What he saw made his stomach sink. There was blood, not much, but enough. A small, dark stain was spreading beneath the mother's hindquarters, visible now that the mud had begun to dry and flake away. Mark's breath caught. She was pregnant, heavily pregnant based on the size of her abdomen, and she was bleeding. The implications crashed over him like a wave. The stress of being trapped for hours, the cold, the physical trauma of the extraction. Any one of those things could trigger premature labor or worse. And out here, miles from any veterinary help, with no equipment, no medicine, no way to intervene if something went catastrophically wrong. Mark pulled out his phone again, checking desperately for a signal. Nothing. He was completely alone in this, and the situation had just become exponentially more complex. The mother bear made a low sound, not a growl, but something deeper, more primal, a sound of pain. Her body tensed, and Mark saw her abdomen contract visibly beneath the mud-matted fur. He'd watched enough animals give birth to recognize what was happening. She was going into labor. "No," Mark whispered, "not yet. It's too soon." But nature didn't negotiate, didn't wait for convenient timing or safe circumstances. The mother bear's body was responding to trauma and stress in the most fundamental way possible, by trying to expel the unborn cubs before they were lost. The cub seemed to sense that something was wrong. It pressed closer to its mother, making anxious whining sounds, looking to Mark as if asking him to fix this new problem too. Mark's mind raced through options. He couldn't carry a 300-pound bear anywhere. He couldn't stop labor once it had started. He couldn't call for help. The nearest ranger station was an hour away on foot, and even if he ran the entire distance, help wouldn't arrive in time. By the time anyone reached this remote ravine, whatever was going to happen would have already happened. He was going to have to help her through this. Here, now, with nothing but his basic wilderness supplies and whatever knowledge he could pull from memories of watching his mother work. The realization was terrifying. He wasn't a veterinarian. He wasn't trained for this. But he was all this bear had. Mark forced himself to think systematically, to push past fear into the practical steps he could take. First, warmth. The mother bear needed to stop losing body heat. He gathered armfuls of dry leaves and pine needles, piling them around her body as insulation. She tolerated this, too exhausted to protest. The cub helped, instinctively understanding, pushing leaves closer with its small paws. Second, water. The mother needed hydration after hours of stress. Mark had 2 water bottles in his pack. He poured one into a shallow depression in a rock near the bear's head. She sniffed it, then began to lap at it weakly. Good. She was still alert enough to drink. Third, space and calm. Birthing animals needed to feel safe, protected. Mark positioned himself at a distance where he could observe without crowding her, where she could see him but not feel threatened. The cub stayed close to its mother, and Mark didn't interfere with that. The cub's presence might actually help keep her calm. Another contraction rippled through the mother bear's body. She grunted softly, her legs flexing. The cub watched with wide eyes, confused by what was happening to its mother, but determined to stay close. Mark checked his watch. 10:30 in the morning. He'd found the bears around 8. 2.5 hours had passed. His wife, Rachel, would be expecting him back at their cabin by noon. When he didn't show up, she'd start to worry. By 2 o'clock, she'd probably drive to the ranger station to report him overdue. But even then, they'd be searching the main trails, the known routes. No one would think to look in this remote ravine for hours, maybe not until tomorrow. He was truly on his own. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air. The mist had completely burned away, and the forest was alive with sound, jays calling, squirrels chattering, the distant hammer of a woodpecker. It seemed surreal that all around them, life continued its normal patterns, while here, in this small depression, something extraordinary and precarious was unfolding. Mark pulled his journal from his pack. He always carried it, a habit from years of documenting wildlife observations. He began to write, noting the time, the bear's condition, what he was seeing. If something went wrong, if the worst happened, at least there would be a record. Someone would understand what had occurred here. But he also wrote because it calmed him, gave his hands something to do, helped him think. He described the cub's behavior, the remarkable intelligence and trust it had shown. He described the mother's condition, the signs of labor, the blood. He wrote about the impossible choice he'd made to intervene and the impossible situation he now found himself in. Another contraction, stronger this time. The mother bear groaned, and the sound was so human in its expression of pain that Mark felt it in his chest. The cub nuzzled her face, making soft chirping sounds of comfort. Mark set down his journal and moved closer again. The mother bear's eyes found his, and in them he saw something he'd never forget. Not just pain or fear, but a kind of desperate hope. She knew he'd saved her from the mud. Some part of her wild intelligence was hoping, perhaps even trusting, that he could help her through this too. "I'm here," Mark said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone." The words were as much for himself as for the bear. He was making a commitment, sealing a bond that had formed the moment that Cub had looked at him on the trail and asked for help. He would see this through, whatever came. Success or tragedy, he would be present for it. The mother bear closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. Another contraction. Mark could see the rhythms beginning to establish. They were coming closer together now. Labor was progressing, whether her body was ready or not, whether the cubs were developed enough to survive or not. The sun caught the trees at an angle, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy. A breeze moved through the ravine, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something else, something ancient and elemental. Birth, blood, life insisting on itself against all odds. The cub suddenly stood, alert, looking toward the forest. Mark followed its gaze but saw nothing. Then he heard it. A distant sound, almost at the edge of perception. Other bears? A predator? The cub's ears swiveled, tracking the sound, then it relaxed slightly. Whatever it had heard wasn't a threat. Mark realized with a start that he'd been so focused on the immediate crisis that he hadn't considered the larger picture. They were in bear territory, during a season when food was scarce and animals were ranging widely to prepare for winter. Other bears could be nearby. A male bear would see the cub as potential competition and might attack. A threatened mother could draw unwanted attention. He couldn't protect them from everything. He couldn't control the wilderness. All he could do was stay present, stay alert, and hope that the forest would grant them the time and space they needed. The mother bear shifted position, trying to find comfort. Her breathing changed. Deeper now, more focused. She was entering the active phase of labor. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon. Mark pulled his jacket around his shoulders, settled into a comfortable position, and prepared to bear witness to whatever came next. The cub curled against its mother's chest, and the three of them, human, cub, and mother, waited together in the dappled sunlight, bound by circumstance and choice into this strange, sacred moment. The forest held its breath. The contractions were coming every few minutes now, each one causing the mother bear's entire body to tense and strain. Mark watched helplessly, feeling the weight of his inadequacy. He'd seen animals give birth before, had even assisted his mother with difficult deliveries when he was younger. But this was different. This was a wild creature beyond his control or understanding, going through something that could end in disaster at any moment. The cub had moved to sit beside Mark, as if sensing that its mother needed space. The small bear leaned against his leg, warm and solid and trusting. Mark reached down absently, his fingers finding the soft fur behind the cub's ears. The gesture seemed to calm them both. "She's strong," Mark murmured to the cub. "Your mom is incredibly strong." He needed to believe that. Needed to believe that the same fierce determination that had kept her alive through hours of being trapped in freezing mud would carry her through this too. But the odds were stacked against her. Premature cubs had low survival rates. The stress and cold could cause complications. Internal injuries from the struggle in the pit could be bleeding somewhere he couldn't see. Mark forced himself to focus on what he could control. He'd learned from his mother that animals in labor needed three things: safety, comfort, and minimal interference. He'd already done what he could for the first two. Now he needed to trust the process, to recognize when to help and when to simply be present. Another contraction. The mother bear groaned, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Her hind legs tensed, pushing. Mark saw movement beneath her tail, and his heart began to race. Something was happening. He moved closer, slowly, speaking in that same calm voice. "That's it, Mama. You're doing great. Just breathe through it." The words were ridiculous. She was a wild bear, not a woman in a hospital. But something in his tone seemed to register. The mother bear's eyes found his, and for a moment they were connected by something deeper than species, deeper than fear. They were two living beings, united in the struggle to bring new life into the world. Minutes passed. The contractions intensified. Mark could see the mother bear's exhaustion growing with each wave of labor. She'd been through so much already. The hours trapped in the mud, the violent extraction, the cold, the stress. Her body was running on reserves that had to be nearly depleted. The cub whimpered softly, pressing closer to Mark. He understood. Watching someone you love in pain was its own kind of agony, made worse by the inability to help. Then Mark saw it, a small, dark shape beginning to emerge. The first cub was coming. His breath caught. He'd been preparing himself for the worst, but seeing actual life emerging filled him with a sudden, fierce hope. The mother bear pushed, her entire body engaged in the effort. The cub emerged slowly, enclosed in its birth sac, tiny and impossibly fragile. The mother bear twisted her head around, instinct taking over. With surprising gentleness, she began to clean the newborn, her tongue working to remove the membrane, to stimulate breathing. For long, terrible seconds, the tiny cub didn't move. Mark felt his chest tighten, fear flooding through him. Then, a small sound, a squeaking cry. The newborn cub's tiny legs twitched, and its mouth opened in protest at this cold, bright world it had been thrust into. It was alive. Mark felt tears spring to his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. There was something profoundly moving about witnessing birth, especially under these circumstances, in a wild place, with no medical intervention, just a mother's body doing what bodies had been designed to do for millions of years. The older cub stood on its hind legs, trying to see its new sibling. It made excited huffing sounds, clearly fascinated and confused in equal measure. Mark kept a gentle hand on its shoulder, holding it back from rushing to its mother. The newborn needed space, needed those crucial first moments of bonding and cleaning and warmth. But the mother bear wasn't finished. Another contraction rippled through her, stronger than before. Mark understood. There was at least one more cub still to come. Black bears typically gave birth to 2 or 3 cubs. She was carrying multiples, and all of them were coming now, ready or not. Mark checked his surroundings, his mind shifting into a more active mode. The first cub seemed healthy, already beginning to nuzzle toward its mother's warmth, but the next one might not be as lucky. Premature births sometimes meant weaker cubs, cubs that needed help to survive those critical first minutes. He pulled his fleece shirt from his pack, clean, dry and warm. If he needed to stimulate a cub's breathing or warm a cold body, he'd have something to use. He also had a small first aid kit with latex gloves. His mother had taught him that even with animals, hygiene mattered. If he had to physically assist with the birth, he couldn't risk introducing infection. The thought of actually touching one of these newborn cubs, of intervening in such an intimate process, made his hands tremble. But he'd come this far. He couldn't turn away now. The second cub came faster than the first. One moment the mother bear was straining, and the next, a tiny dark form slid out onto the leaves. The mother immediately turned her attention to it, repeating the cleaning process. This one was smaller than the first, its cries weaker. Mark watched anxiously as the mother licked it vigorously, trying to stimulate circulation, to warm it, to bring it fully to life. The tiny cub wasn't responding as quickly as its sibling had. Its movements were sluggish, its cries faint. The mother bear worked more urgently, her tongue rasping across the small body, but something wasn't right. Mark made a decision. He pulled on the latex gloves and moved closer, his heart hammering. "I need to help," he said softly. "Let me help." The mother bear looked at him. For a suspended moment, everything hung in balance. She could kill him now, maternal instinct overriding the strange trust they'd built. She could see him as a threat to her vulnerable newborns and attack. Every rational part of Mark's brain screamed at him to back away. But he didn't, and neither did she. The mother bear, in a gesture that defied everything Mark understood about wild animals, shifted slightly, giving him access to the struggling cub. With hands that shook from more than cold, Mark reached for the tiny bear. It was shockingly small, no bigger than a squirrel, its eyes sealed shut, its fur thin and dark. He could feel how cold it was, how weak. He wrapped it in his fleece shirt and began to rub gently but firmly, the way he'd seen his mother do with newborn puppies and kittens. Stimulating circulation, generating warmth, encouraging that first deep breath that would fully inflate the lungs. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on, little one. You can do this." The older cub watched intently, its small face serious. The mother bear had turned her attention to the first newborn, who was already trying to nurse, its tiny mouth seeking warmth and food. But her eyes kept returning to Mark, to the second cub in his hands, watching to see if this strange human could work another miracle. Mark rubbed the cub's chest, its back, its tiny legs. He cleared its nose and mouth of any remaining membrane. He breathed warm air onto its face. Seconds stretched into minutes. His arms ached, his heart ached. Then the cub gasped, a real breath, deep and full. Its legs kicked with sudden strength. Its mouth opened in a cry that was startlingly loud from such a tiny creature. Life was asserting itself, refusing to be denied. Mark laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. He cradled the cub close for just a moment longer, feeling the miracle of its small heart beating against his palm. Then carefully, reverently, he placed it near its mother's belly, near its sibling. The mother bear immediately began to clean this cub too, and within moments it was nuzzling toward the warmth of her body, toward the promise of milk and safety. Both newborns were alive, both were fighting. But the mother bear's body tensed again. Mark saw her abdomen contract. There was a third cub. This time something was clearly wrong. The mother bear pushed, strained, but nothing happened. She tried again, groaning with effort. Minutes passed. The contraction ended, and she lay panting, but no cub had emerged. Mark felt cold dread settle into his stomach. The cub was stuck, or positioned wrong, or too large. Any number of complications could be preventing it from being born, and every minute it remained trapped inside increased the danger, not just to the unborn cub, but to the mother. A prolonged, obstructed labor could kill her. Mark looked at the mother bear's exhausted face, at the two tiny cubs nursing at her belly, at the older cub watching everything with worried eyes. He looked at his own hands, still covered in birth fluids despite the gloves, still trembling with adrenaline and fear. He'd saved her from the mud. He'd helped the second cub breathe. But this was beyond him. This required knowledge and skill he didn't possess. This required intervention that could go catastrophically wrong. The mother bear's eyes found his again, and in them was something that looked like a plea. Mark knelt in the leaves and pine needles, surrounded by bears, miles from any help, and faced the hardest decision of his life. Walk away and let nature take its course, which might mean the mother bear dying, leaving 3 cubs orphaned and helpless. Or try to help, knowing he could make things worse, knowing he could injure or kill both mother and cub with one wrong move. The forest seemed to grow quiet around him, as if waiting for his answer. The older cub walked over and sat directly in front of Mark, looking up at him with those dark, trusting eyes. The same eyes that had found him on the trail hours ago and begged for help, the same trust that had brought him to this moment. Mark took a deep breath. He thought of his mother, of all the times he'd watched her face impossible situations with calm determination. He thought of what she would say: "You do what you can, with what you have, where you are, and you do it with love." He looked at the mother bear. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, I'm going to try." He didn't know if what he was about to attempt would save a life or end one. He didn't know if he had the skill or the courage or the wisdom to do this right. But he knew he had to try, because that's what compassion demanded. That's what love required. That's what being human, truly human, meant. The mother bear watched him approach, and she didn't move away. Together, they prepared to fight for one more life. Mark's hands hovered in the air for a moment, uncertainty freezing him in place. Everything he'd learned about wilderness safety, about respecting the boundaries between human and wild, about not interfering with nature, all of it screamed at him to stop. But louder than that was something else, the absolute conviction that walking away now would be a betrayal of everything that had happened this morning, of the trust that had been placed in him by creatures who had no reason to trust humans at all. He stripped off the soiled gloves and put on a fresh pair from his first aid kit. His hands were steadier now, his mind clearer. Fear was still there, coiled tight in his chest, but it was joined by focus. He'd watched his mother perform difficult deliveries dozens of times. He'd assisted with breech births, with oversized puppies, with complications that seemed impossible until they weren't. The species was different, but the fundamental mechanics were the same. He just had to remember. He had to trust his training, his instincts, and the strange connection he'd formed with this mother bear. "I need to examine you," Mark said softly, moving closer. "I need to see what's happening." The mother bear was panting heavily now, her tongue lolling. Another contraction came, and she pushed with everything she had left, but still nothing emerged. The effort was clearly agonizing. Mark could see the exhaustion and pain in every line of her body. She'd been through too much already. Her reserves were dangerously depleted. The 2 newborn cubs were nursing weakly, making tiny sounds. The older cub had moved to sit beside them, as if standing guard. It looked up at Mark, then at its mother, then back at Mark. The message was clear: help her. Mark positioned himself behind the mother bear, speaking constantly in that low, soothing voice. "I'm going to touch you now. I know it's uncomfortable. I know you're scared, but I'm trying to help. Please trust me just a little bit longer." His hands approached, and the mother bear's muscles tensed. But she didn't strike out, didn't growl. She was allowing this, even though every instinct must be screaming at her that a human touching her in this vulnerable moment was dangerous. Mark very gently palpated her abdomen, the way he'd seen his mother do countless times. He could feel the shape of something inside, the 3rd cub. It was definitely still alive. He could detect movement, but it wasn't positioned correctly. He thought he could feel a leg, Or maybe a head at an awkward angle blocking the birth canal, a breech presentation. Or perhaps the cub was simply too large. Either way, it wasn't coming out on its own. Mark's mother had told him once that the hardest part of emergency veterinary work wasn't the technical skill. It was the split-second decision-making, the weighing of risks, the acceptance that sometimes there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. He had two options. He could attempt to manually reposition the cub from the outside, using careful pressure to guide it into a better position. Or he could attempt internal manipulation, actually reaching inside to physically move the cub or pull it out. The first was safer, but might not work. The second was dangerous for everyone involved, but had a better chance of success. Another contraction came, and the mother bear's body convulsed with effort. She was running out of time. If this went on much longer, she could rupture internally, could hemorrhage, could go into shock. The cub inside could suffocate or sustain brain damage from lack of oxygen. Mark made his choice. "I'm going to have to go inside," he said, though he doubted the bear understood the words. "I'm sorry, this is going to hurt, but it's the only way." He removed one glove and replaced it with a fresh one, then poured water from his bottle over his hand, trying to create as much cleanliness as possible under impossible conditions. His mother's voice in his head: "Infection kills more animals than difficult births. Clean hands, gentle movements, confidence." The mother bear's breathing changed as Mark positioned himself. She knew something was coming. Her body tensed. For a terrifying moment, Mark thought she might finally reject this intervention, might turn on him in a last burst of protective fury. But she didn't. She lowered her head to the ground, closed her eyes, and waited. The trust in that gesture broke something open in Mark's chest. This wild animal, who owed humans nothing, who had every reason to fear and hate them, was choosing to trust him with her life and the life of her unborn cub. "Thank you," Mark whispered. "Thank you for trusting me." He took a deep breath and began. The internal examination was delicate, painstaking work. Mark moved slowly, carefully, his fingers searching for the shape of the cub, trying to understand its position. The mother bear groaned softly but remained still. Her body was hot inside, the muscles contracting around his hand. He could feel the cub moving weakly, definitely alive, but clearly in distress. It took him several agonizing minutes to piece together the situation. The cub was larger than its siblings, and its head was turned at the wrong angle. One front leg was tucked back instead of extended forward. The position made it impossible for the cub to pass through the birth canal. Every contraction was just wedging it tighter. Mark's fingers found the cub's leg. It was slippery with amniotic fluid, tiny and impossibly fragile beneath his touch. If he pulled too hard, he could break it. If he didn't pull hard enough, nothing would change. He needed to extend that leg forward, align the head, and create a pathway for the cub to emerge. "Okay, little one," Mark murmured. "We're going to do this together. Easy now." He began to manipulate the cub's position, working between contractions when the muscles weren't as tight. It was like solving a complex puzzle blindfolded, relying entirely on touch and spatial awareness. He guided the leg forward, millimeter by millimeter. The mother bear trembled but held still, some deep instinct telling her that this pain was necessary, that this human was trying to help. Sweat dripped down Mark's face despite the cool air. His shoulder ached from the awkward angle. His fingers were cramping, but slowly, he was making progress. The leg extended, the head shifted slightly. "That's it," he breathed. "Come on." Another contraction started, and this time Mark worked with it, using the pressure to help guide the cub into position. The mother bear pushed, and Mark pulled gently but firmly, his movements synchronized with her body's efforts. It felt like they were working as a team, human and bear united in the singular goal of bringing this life into the world. The cub's head appeared, and Mark's heart leaped. "There! I see it! You're doing it!" The mother bear pushed again, harder now, sensing that success was near. The cub's shoulders emerged, then its body, and suddenly Mark was holding a tiny, squirming bear cub in his hands, pulling it fully into the world. It was covered in fluid and completely still. Mark's elation turned instantly to panic. The cub wasn't breathing. Its body was limp, its color wrong. It had been in distress too long, stuck without oxygen, its tiny system shutting down. "No," Mark said. "No, no, no, come on." He laid the cub on his fleece shirt and began to work. He cleared its airways, wiping membrane from its nose and mouth. He rubbed its chest vigorously, trying to stimulate the heart, the lungs, the nervous system. Nothing. The tiny body remained lifeless in his hands. The older cub approached, whimpering softly. The mother bear lifted her head, her eyes finding the still form of her third cub. Mark saw something in her expression that looked like grief, like acceptance. She'd done everything she could. Now nature would decide. But Mark wasn't ready to accept that, not after everything they'd been through, not after that impossible trust, that extraordinary effort. He remembered something his mother had done once with a stillborn kitten, a technique that seemed absurd, but had worked when nothing else did. He cupped the tiny cub in both hands and brought it close to his mouth. Then he breathed, a gentle puff of air directly into the cub's nose. Once, twice, 3 times. The cub's chest rose slightly with each breath. Mark rubbed it again, warming it, stimulating it. He breathed into it again, sharing his own life force with this tiny creature who hadn't yet taken its first breath. "Please," Mark whispered. "Please, fight. Your mom fought so hard for you. Your sibling fought. I fought. Now you have to fight too." The forest was absolutely silent. Even the birds had stopped calling. The sun had climbed nearly to its zenith, and the light fell in cathedral rays through the canopy, illuminating the small clearing like a stage. Mark breathed into the cub again, rubbed its chest, breathed again, and then a gasp, so faint he almost missed it. The tiny mouth opened. The small chest expanded on its own. The legs twitched. The cub cried out, a thin, reedy sound, but unmistakably alive. Mark laughed and cried at the same time, tears streaming down his face as he held the miracle in his hands. "Yes, yes, that's it. Breathe! You're alive!" He quickly placed the cub near its mother's belly, near its siblings. The mother bear immediately began cleaning it, her tongue working over every inch of the tiny body, warming it, welcoming it, bonding with it. The cub responded, wriggling toward the warmth, toward the promise of milk, toward life. All 3 cubs were now at their mother's belly, nursing or trying to nurse, their tiny bodies pressed against her warmth. The older cub approached and very gently nuzzled each of the newborns, as if greeting them, welcoming them to the family. Mark sat back on his heels, his entire body shaking. He'd done it. Against impossible odds, against his own doubts and fears, against the cruel mathematics of nature, he'd actually done it. All 3 cubs were alive. The mother was alive. They'd survived. The mother bear lifted her head and looked at him, and what passed between them in that moment transcended language, transcended species. It was recognition, gratitude, connection, the acknowledgement that something profound had occurred here, something that neither of them would ever forget. Mark remained where he was, not wanting to disturb the family's first moments together. The newborns were so tiny, so vulnerable, covered in their mother's scent now, already learning to nurse, already fighting to thrive. The oldest cub sat protectively nearby, clearly taking its role as big sibling seriously. The sun had warmed the air considerably. The mud pit that had started this entire chain of events lay empty behind them, already beginning to dry in the heat. In a few days, there would be no sign of what had happened there, no evidence of the hours of terror and struggle. Nature would reclaim it, as nature always did. But Mark would remember. These bears would remember. And something had shifted in the fabric of the world, some small thread of connection between species that had been there all along but rarely revealed itself. He slowly began gathering his supplies, moving quietly so as not to disturb the bears. His body was starting to register all the abuse it had taken, the cold, the exertion, the stress. His hands were raw and bleeding, his legs were numb, his shoulders ached. He was covered in mud and blood and fluids he didn't want to think about too closely. And he had never felt more alive. The mother bear was resting now, her breathing steadier, her body relaxed for the first time in hours. The crisis had passed. She would need food and water and rest, but she would recover. The cubs would need constant care and warmth, but they had a mother to provide that. The older cub would need to learn to share attention, but it seemed eager to help rather than jealous. They would be okay. The family would survive. Mark pulled out his phone one more time, checking for signal. Still nothing. He'd been gone for nearly 5 hours now. Rachel would be frantic. The rangers would probably be organizing a search, but he couldn't leave yet. Not until he was sure the bears were stable. Not until he'd seen them through these crucial first hours. He settled onto a log at the edge of the clearing, far enough away to give the bears space, close enough to intervene if needed. The older cub looked at him, seemed to consider, then trotted over and sat beside him again. It leaned against his leg, and Mark rested his hand on its head. "You did good today," Mark said softly. "You saved your family. You were brave and smart, and you didn't give up. Your mom should be proud of you." The cub made a soft huffing sound, almost like agreement. They sat together in companionable silence, watching the mother nurse her newborns, watching the sunlight move across the forest floor, watching life continue in all its messy, miraculous, impossible beauty. Mark pulled out his journal again and began to write, documenting everything that had happened with careful detail. The times, the procedures, the outcomes, but he also wrote about the feelings, the connections, the moments that couldn't be captured in clinical language. He wrote about trust and courage, and the strange alchemy that happened when one being chose to help another across the vast divide of difference. An hour passed, then another. The newborn cubs were nursing steadily now, their tiny bodies already looking stronger, more vigorous. The mother bear slept in brief intervals, exhausted but alive. The older cub alternated between sitting with Mark and checking on its family, clearly trying to understand its new role in the changed dynamics. Finally, around 1 in the afternoon, Mark heard it. Distant voices calling his name. The search party had found his trail, had somehow tracked him to this remote ravine. Relief flooded through him. Help was coming. He could get the mother bear properly checked, could ensure the newborns had the best chance at survival. But before he stood to call back, before he let the human world rush back in with all its noise and questions and complications, Mark looked one more time at the mother bear. She was watching him, her dark eyes calm and knowing. And in that moment, Mark understood that this was goodbye. Once other humans arrived, once rangers and veterinarians and officials swarmed the area, the bears would retreat back into their wild nature. The strange bubble of trust that had formed between them would pop. They would return to being what they were supposed to be, separate species, living parallel lives that rarely intersected. "Thank you," Mark said softly. "Thank you for trusting me." The mother bear blinked slowly, and Mark chose to believe it was acknowledgement. Then he stood and called out to the searchers, his voice echoing through the trees. "Here, I'm here, and you need to see this." The miracle was about to be shared with the world, but it would always belong, first and foremost, to the beings who had lived it. A mother's love, a cub's courage, and a human's choice to answer when help was asked for, no matter how impossible the request seemed. The forest had witnessed it all, and the forest would keep the secret of just how extraordinary it had truly been. The first person to break through the undergrowth was a young ranger named Sarah Chen, her radio crackling at her hip, her face flushed from running. She stopped so abruptly when she saw the scene that the 2 men behind her nearly collided with her back. "Mark, we've been—" Her words died as her brain caught up with what her eyes were seeing. A massive black bear lying in a nest of leaves and pine needles. 3 impossibly tiny cubs nursing at her belly, an older cub sitting calmly beside a mud-covered man who looked like he'd been through a war. What in the— Mark held up a hand, his voice low and urgent. "Slowly. Move very slowly. She's just given birth. She's exhausted and protective." The other 2 rangers, Tom Bradshaw, a veteran with 30 years in the Forest Service, and Miguel Santos, a wildlife biologist, emerged behind Sarah. Tom's hand instinctively went to the bear spray on his belt, but Miguel grabbed his wrist, stopping him. Miguel's trained eye was already taking in the details. The dried mud on the mother bear's coat, the evidence of recent birth, the placenta still visible on the ground, the way the older cub was positioned between the humans and its family, but showing no aggression. "Mark," Miguel said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "what happened here?" Mark felt the exhaustion hit him all at once, now that help had arrived. His legs trembled, his hands shook. The adrenaline that had kept him functioning for hours was draining away, leaving only bone-deep fatigue in its wake. "She was trapped," he said, his voice rough, "in a mud pit. For hours. The cub found me, brought me here. I got her out, but the stress triggered premature labor. 3 cubs. The 3rd one was breech. I had to—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at his bloody, mud-caked clothes. "They're alive. All of them are alive." The 3 rangers stared at him as if he'd just announced he'd flown to the moon and back. Sarah pulled out her radio, but Miguel stopped her with a gesture. "Not yet. Let's assess the situation first. We don't want helicopters or crowds scaring her off." Miguel approached slowly, every movement deliberate and non-threatening. He'd spent his career studying bear behavior, and what he was witnessing defied most of what he knew. The mother bear tracked his approach, but showed none of the defensive aggression he would have expected. She was too tired, yes, but it was more than that. There was an unusual calm in her demeanor, a tolerance that suggested she'd somehow learned to accept human presence, at least for now. The older cub watched Miguel intently, but didn't move from Mark's side. That detail alone told Miguel volumes about what must have transpired here. "She's in rough shape," Miguel said after a careful visual examination from a safe distance. "Hypothermia, probably dehydrated, definitely exhausted. But the fact that she's nursing is a good sign. The cubs look small, premature for sure, but their color is good, and they're actively feeding." Tom had his phone out, taking photos and video. "No one's going to believe this," he muttered. "A man delivering bear cubs in the middle of nowhere. This is unprecedented," Miguel finished. He looked at Mark with something like awe. "You understand, what you did here is probably one of the most remarkable wildlife interactions I've ever heard of. Bears don't ask humans for help. They don't trust humans. This one did," Mark said simply. He reached down to touch the older cub's head once more. "This little one did." Sarah had pulled out a field medical kit and was approaching Mark now. "Let me look at you. You're bleeding." Mark glanced down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. The skin was raw and torn from the rope, from the mud, from hours of rough work. His legs were covered in scratches and bruises. He probably looked like he'd survived a disaster. "I'm fine," he said automatically. "You're not fine," Sarah countered, her tone brooking no argument. "You're hypothermic, probably in shock, and those hands need cleaning before infection sets in. Sit." Mark sat. The older cub pressed closer, as if offering comfort. Sarah began cleaning his wounds with practiced efficiency, her touch gentle but thorough. Tom had moved back to the trail to call for additional support. Not a full emergency response, but a wildlife veterinarian, and maybe a few more experienced rangers who could help monitor the situation. Miguel continued his assessment of the bears from a respectful distance. "The mother's going to need food and water soon. She's burned through all her reserves. The cubs need to stay warm. Premature bears have trouble regulating body temperature. If we had a way to provide supplemental heat without disturbing them—" My emergency blanket, Mark said, wincing as Sarah applied antiseptic. In my pack, it's thermal. If we could drape it near them over those branches, it might create a warmer microclimate. Miguel nodded approvingly. Smart. Sarah, can you? On it. Sarah finished bandaging Mark's hands and retrieved the emergency blanket from his pack. Moving with exquisite slowness, she approached the makeshift nest and carefully draped the reflective material over nearby branches, creating a shelter that would trap heat without closing the bears in. The mother bear watched but didn't object. The cubs continued nursing, oblivious to the human activity around them. Tom returned, slightly out of breath. Doctor, Walsh is on her way. Should be here in 45 minutes. I told her to come prepared for anything. County Sheriff wanted to know if we needed emergency medical evacuation for you, Mark. I don't, Mark said firmly. I'm staying until I know they're going to be okay. Rachel's name suddenly exploded in his mind. His wife. She must be terrified. Tom, can you call my wife? Tell her I'm safe. Tell her... He paused, not sure how to even begin explaining what had happened. Tell her I'll explain everything, but I'm okay. Already did, Tom said with a slight smile. Called her first thing when Sarah found you. She wanted to come herself, but I told her we'd bring you out as soon as possible. Miguel had sat down on a log near Mark, his biologist's mind clearly racing through the implications of what he was witnessing. Mark, I need to document this properly. Everything that happened. The timeline, the interventions you performed, the bear's responses. This could reshape our understanding of bear cognition and behavior. The fact that the cub sought you out specifically, that the mother allowed you to assist with the birth, these aren't behaviors we've documented in black bears before. The cub was desperate, Mark said. Any human would have done, but not any human would have followed through. Miguel countered. You could have called us and waited. You could have decided it was too dangerous. Most people would have, but you didn't. Mark looked at the mother bear, at the 3 tiny lives nursing at her belly, at the older cub who had refused to abandon hope. How could I walk away? How could anyone walk away from that? Sarah sat down on Mark's other side. Most people could. Most people do. We like to think we're connected to nature, but when it asks something hard of us, we retreat to safety. You didn't. She paused, then added softly, My grandmother used to say that we're only truly human when we help something that can't help us back. I never really understood what she meant until now. They sat in silence for a while, watching the bears, listening to the small sounds of the forest, returning to its normal rhythms. Birds began calling again. A squirrel chattered somewhere in the canopy. The sun continued its arc across the sky, and the quality of light shifted from the harsh brightness of midday to the softer, warmer tones of afternoon. Dr. Evelyn Walsh arrived with 2 additional rangers carrying equipment. She was a woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. She took one look at the scene and let out a low whistle. Well, she said, Tom wasn't exaggerating. And then Miguel brought her up to speed in quick clinical terms, but even his professional detachment couldn't completely mask his amazement. Dr. Walsh listened, asked pointed questions, and then spent 20 minutes observing the bears from various angles without approaching closer than necessary. Finally, she nodded. The mother's stable for now, exhausted, mildly hypothermic, but she's doing the right things, nursing, cleaning the cubs, staying calm. The cubs appear viable, though they're definitely premature. I'd estimate they're maybe 2 weeks early, which is significant for bears. They're going to need constant monitoring for the next 72 hours. How do we do that without traumatizing them? Sarah asked. Dr. Walsh considered. Ideally, we'd bring them to a wildlife rehabilitation center. But moving her now, in her condition with newborns, it's risky. And there's another factor. She looked at Mark. She trusts you. I don't know how or why, but she does. That trust might not extend to a facility full of strangers. What are you suggesting? Mark asked, though part of him already knew. We monitor them here. Set up a rotation of rangers to observe from a distance. Bring in food and water. Leave it close enough that she can access it without feeling threatened. Give her time to recover. Give the cubs time to stabilize. In a few days, if they're strong enough, we can consider relocation to a safer area. And if something goes wrong in the meantime, Tom asked, then we have people nearby who can respond, Dr. Walsh said. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternatives. The plans solidified quickly after that. Tom and one of the other rangers would take the first watch, setting up a discreet observation post 50 yards away. Sarah would hike out to get supplies, high-calorie food suitable for a nursing mother bear, medical equipment in case of emergency, camping gear for the rangers who would be stationed here. Miguel would coordinate with the wildlife department and begin the documentation process. And Mark would go home, eventually. Dr. Walsh insisted on examining him first, checking his core temperature, assessing him for shock, bandaging his wounds more thoroughly than Sarah's field treatment had allowed. "You're a lucky man," Dr. Walsh said as she worked. "Hypothermia, exhaustion, lacerations, probable muscle strain, but nothing that won't heal, physically at least." She met his eyes. "Emotionally, psychologically, an experience like this changes people. Don't be surprised if you have trouble processing it." Mark nodded, but he was only half listening. His attention was on the bears. The mother had shifted position slightly, getting more comfortable. The 3 newborns were sleeping now, tiny, furry lumps pressed against her warmth. The older cub had finally relaxed enough to lie down, though its eyes remained open, watchful. As the afternoon wore on, and the rangers prepared for the night's vigil, Mark felt the weight of goodbye settling on his shoulders. He'd been part of this family's life for 9 hours, hours that felt like days, that felt like a lifetime. But they weren't his family. They were wild creatures who would return to their wild lives once this crisis passed. His role was over. He stood slowly, his body protesting every movement. The older cub immediately stood too, alert. Mark walked toward the bears one last time, moving slowly, telegraphing his intentions. The mother bear watched him come, and there was recognition in her eyes. "You're going to be okay," Mark said softly. "Your cubs are strong. You're strong. These people will watch over you until you're ready to leave, and then you'll go back to the forest and you'll raise your family, and maybe sometimes you'll remember the strange day when a human helped you. Maybe not. Either way, I'm grateful I was here. I'm grateful you trusted me." The mother bear blinked slowly, that same gesture from earlier. The older cub approached and pressed its forehead against Mark's leg one last time, and Mark felt his composure finally crack. Tears ran down his face, and he didn't try to stop them. "Thank you," he whispered to the cub. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for being brave. Take care of your mum and your siblings." Miguel appeared at his elbow. "Come on, Mark. Let's get you home. Rachel's probably ready to either kill you or never let you out of her sight again." Mark let himself be led away, though he looked back 3 times before the trees blocked his view. The last thing he saw was the older cub, sitting at attention, watching him go. The hike back to the trailhead passed in a blur. Other rangers had arrived, bringing fresh supplies and relieving the early responders. Word was already spreading. Someone's phone had signal, and the photos Tom had taken were making their way through the ranger network. By the time Mark reached his truck, where Rachel was waiting with blankets and tears and fierce embraces, the story had taken on a life of its own. But Mark barely noticed. All he could think about was a mud pit at dawn, a cub's pleading eyes, a mother's trust, and 3 tiny lives fighting to exist. All he could feel was the profound, terrifying, beautiful truth that sometimes, when the world asked the impossible, you just had to say yes. And that yes could change everything. The first 3 days were the hardest. Mark couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that ravine, feeling the cold mud, hearing the mother bear's labored breathing, holding a lifeless cub in his hands and breathing life into it. Rachel would wake in the night to find him sitting at the window, staring out at the dark forest, his bandaged hands resting on the sill. "They're okay," she would say, coming to stand beside him. "Miguel called. They're all okay." And they were. The rangers rotated watches around the clock, documenting everything from a respectful distance. The mother bear ate the food they left: salmon, berries, high-calorie supplements designed for wildlife rehabilitation. She drank the water. She nursed her cubs constantly, and slowly her strength returned. The 3 newborns were thriving against all odds, their tiny bodies growing stronger each day. The older cub stayed close, learning its role as protector and helper. Dr. Walsh visited twice daily, observing through binoculars, taking notes. "It's remarkable," she told Mark over the phone on day 4. "The cub's weight is increasing appropriately. No signs of infection or failure to thrive. The mother's condition has stabilized completely. In another week, they'll be ready to be relocated to a more remote area where they can den for the winter without human interference." Mark absorbed the news with relief and a strange, hollow sadness he couldn't quite name. They were going to survive. The story would have a happy ending. But something in him mourned the closing of that brief window when his world and theirs had overlapped so completely. On the 5th day, Mark returned to the ravine. He'd asked permission from Miguel and Dr. Walsh, and they'd agreed with the stipulation that he stay at the observation post and not approach the bears. He needed to see them one more time with his own eyes, needed confirmation that the miracle was real and lasting. Sarah was on watch when he arrived. She smiled and made room for him at the blind they'd constructed, a simple shelter that allowed them to observe without being obvious. "They're doing great," she whispered. "Watch." Mark raised the binoculars and felt his breath catch. The mother bear was on her feet, moving around the clearing with something approaching her normal grace. The mud was gone from her coat, revealing the glossy black fur beneath. She was foraging on the food the rangers had left, eating with focused intensity, and there, in the nest of leaves and emergency blankets, were the 4 cubs. The 3 newborns were still tiny but noticeably larger than they'd been 5 days ago. Their movements were stronger, more coordinated. One of them was attempting to walk, wobbling on uncertain legs while its siblings dozed. The older cub was wrestling gently with a stick, playing in the way young bears did, its trauma seemingly forgotten. "She's going to make it," Mark said, and his voice cracked on the words. "They're all going to make it." Sarah nodded. "Thanks to you." "Thanks to her," Mark corrected. "She did the hard part. She survived. She trusted when trust was dangerous. She fought for her cubs, even when she had nothing left to fight with." They watched in silence for a long time. At one point, the older cub looked directly toward the observation post, and Mark wondered if somehow it could sense him there. But the cub simply returned to its play, and Mark told himself it was better this way. The bears needed to return to being wild, to forgetting that humans could be anything other than threats to avoid. The story, meanwhile, had gone viral in ways Mark never anticipated. Someone had leaked Tom's photos to a local news station. From there it spread, local to regional to national to international. "Man delivers bear cubs after dramatic rescue," read the headlines. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. News outlets wanted interviews. Talk shows wanted him as a guest. A film production company had even called asking about rights to the story. Mark turned them all down. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about a moment of connection, of compassion, of doing what needed to be done simply because it needed doing. Turning it into entertainment felt like a betrayal of something sacred. But he did agree to one request. The local elementary school asked if he would come speak to the students about wildlife and conservation. He found himself standing in front of 200 children, trying to explain what had happened in that forest, trying to put into words the weight of the cub's trust and the mother's courage. "The most important thing I learned," Mark told them, is that every life matters. That bear cub could have run away when it saw me. Its mother could have given up, but they didn't. They asked for help, and they fought to survive. And that meant something. It meant everything. A small girl in the front row raised her hand. "Were you scared?" she asked. Mark smiled. "Terrified the whole time. But sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing the right thing anyway." Another hand. "Will you see the bears again?" The question pierced him. "Probably not," Mark said honestly. "They're going to be moved to a place where they can live without humans around. That's what's best for them. Wild animals need to be wild. But I'll always remember them, and I'll always be grateful I could help." On day 10, the relocation happened. Mark wasn't there. Dr. Walsh had gently suggested that his presence might complicate things, and he understood. The bears were tranquilized, examined thoroughly, tagged for research purposes, and transported to a remote section of national forest, far from hiking trails and human habitation. There, they would den for the winter. Come spring, the cubs would emerge larger and stronger, ready to learn how to be bears. Miguel called Mark that evening with the update. "It went perfectly. The mother was in excellent health. You'd never know she'd been through trauma. The cubs all weighed appropriate amounts for their age. The vet gave them all clean bills of health." He paused. "The older cub was the last to go into the transport. Kept looking around like it was searching for something." Mark's throat tightened. "Probably just stressed." "Maybe," Miguel said, "or maybe it was looking for you." After the call ended, Mark sat on his porch as twilight descended. Rachel came out and sat beside him, her hand finding his. They didn't speak for a long time, just watched the forest darken and the first stars emerge. "You've been quiet," Rachel finally said. "Quieter than usual." Mark considered his words carefully. "I keep thinking about that moment when the cub found me on the trail. What if I'd turned away? What if I'd called the rangers and waited? What if I'd decided it was too dangerous, too impossible?" "But you didn't," Rachel said softly. "But I almost did. A dozen times I almost walked away. And if I had," he shook his head, "they would have died, all of them, because I was too scared or too cautious or too convinced that we're not supposed to interfere with nature." Rachel squeezed his hand. "You didn't, though. When it mattered, you chose compassion. You chose to help." "I wish I could say I'll always make that choice," Mark said, "but I'm not sure I will. I'm not sure any of us are capable of that kind of consistency." "Maybe not," Rachel agreed, "but now you know you can. You've proven it to yourself. And maybe that's enough. Maybe knowing that when the moment comes, when you're really tested, you're capable of extraordinary things. Maybe that changes how you move through the world." Mark thought about that. She was right, he realized. Something fundamental had shifted in him during those hours in the ravine. He'd discovered reserves of courage and compassion he hadn't known existed. He'd learned that the boundaries between species weren't as fixed as he'd believed, that trust could form in the most unlikely circumstances, that love, in its broadest, most universal sense, could bridge impossible divides. Winter came to the Cascade foothills. Snow blanketed the forest, and the bears denned, sleeping away the cold months. Mark returned to his photography, but he found himself drawn to different subjects now. He spent hours photographing birds at feeders, deer in snowy clearings, foxes hunting through deep powder. He was looking for something in these images, some echo of that profound connection he'd felt, that moment when human and animal had worked together toward a common goal. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in patches, green returning to the understory. Mark wondered constantly about the bears. Were they awake yet? Were the cubs healthy? Had they survived their first winter? He got his answer in early April. Miguel called, excitement clear in his voice. "We picked up a signal from the mother's tag. She's emerged from the den, and she's got all 4 cubs with her. They're healthy and active. Mark, you did it. They all made it through winter." Mark had to sit down, the relief so intense it made him dizzy. They'd survived. Against all odds, despite everything, they'd survived. "There's something else," Miguel continued. "We've been documenting their behavior. The older cub, the one who found you, is showing remarkable protective instincts toward the younger siblings. It's not uncommon for older cubs to help with younger ones, but this one is exceptional. It's constantly vigilant, always checking on them. Dr. Walsh thinks the trauma and the rescue might have accelerated its maturity. It learned young that sometimes you have to fight for your family, that help doesn't always come from expected places." Mark smiled through the tears on his face. "It learned what I learned." "Yeah," Miguel said softly. "I think you both did." The years that followed brought occasional updates. The mother bear successfully raised all 4 cubs to independence. They dispersed to establish their own territories, as young bears do. The oldest cub, now grown, was spotted several times with its own cubs eventually, still displaying that same protective vigilance. Mark continued his photography, won awards, published books, but he never forgot those hours in the ravine. He kept a single photograph on his desk, one that Tom had taken during the rescue, showing Mark's muddy, exhausted profile as he watched the newborn cub's nurse. In the photo, you could see the older cub pressed against his leg, and in Mark's expression, you could see something profound, the face of someone witnessing a miracle and being transformed by it. People sometimes asked him if he'd do it again, if faced with a similar choice. Mark's answer never varied. "I hope I'd have the courage to say yes, but I hope I never have to find out. Once in a lifetime is enough for something that extraordinary." But he also knew that wasn't entirely true, because every day offered smaller choices, smaller moments where compassion could win over caution, where connection could overcome fear. Every day offered the chance to help something that couldn't help you back, to extend kindness across the boundaries of difference, to choose love over indifference. The bears had taught him that. A desperate cub, a trusting mother, 3 tiny lives fighting to exist. They taught him what it meant to be truly human. Not to dominate nature or control it, but to recognize himself as part of it. To understand that sometimes the wilderness doesn't need us to stay out. It needs us to step in, to help, to care. The forest kept its secrets. The bears lived their wild lives far from human eyes. But Mark carried the memory of that September morning like a sacred thing, a reminder that miracles weren't supernatural events. They were choices made in crucial moments. They were trust offered and trust honored. They were the simple, extraordinary act of refusing to walk away from suffering when you had the power to help. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in those forests, bears were waking to hunt, cubs were learning to fish in streams, mothers were protecting their young. Life continued in its ancient patterns, wild and free and beautiful. And one man, sitting on his porch with bandaged hands that had long since healed, smiled at the memory of the day everything changed. The day a baby bear begged for help, and a human said yes. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever witnessed or lived something like this.